Welcome to today's webinar, The Past, Present, and Future of Electric Bicycling, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The Clearinghouse provides information to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming webinars. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is the Past, Present, and Future of Electric Bicycling. You can also search for event number 925-0444. I would like to acknowledge our partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. So today our speakers are Carlton Reid, Dillon Fitch, and Andrew Brown. Carlton Reid is a senior contributor for Forbes.com and also writes for publications as diverse as The Guardian and the Daily Mail. He is the author of Roads Were Not Built for Cars and Bike Boom, both from Island Press. Based in the UK, in 2018, he was named as the Press Gazette Transport Journalist of the Year. Dillon Fitch studies travel behavior and transportation planning and teaches in the Transportation Technology and Policy Graduate Group in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy. Through field experiments, travel surveys, and crowdsourced data, Dillon's recent research has focused on how road environments influence people's bicycling attitudes and behavior. His current work explores the role of bike shares and other micromobility services in changing travel behavior. He also develops tools to improve planning for bicycles and emerging small vehicles. Finally, since 2018, Andrew Brown has been the creative director at iGo Electric. He also works as a freelance creative director and designer working on brand development, design, and project management. Prior to iGo Electric, Andrew was the art director and a graphic artist for Guru Cycles, where he led the global development of that brand's identity. Following their presentation, our presenters will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. And as usual, and I know a lot of you have been here before, we're going to start with actually a few polls. The first one, which is our typical one, is just asking where everybody's from today so that we can share that with you as well as with our presenters. And so you can see the options on your screen. If you're having any trouble responding to it, you can exit from full screen mode and you should be able to respond. We'll give you a little bit of time to do that. And then we have a couple other questions for you pertinent to our topic today before we get into our presentations. So again, thank you for joining us. We're excited to be here today with you. It's always interesting to see the variation in the audience. given the topic. So today, 34% of you are reporting being in the Mid-Atlantic or Northeast, 24% in the Midwest, 19% in the West, and 18% in the South, and 5% is outside of the US and North America. Our next poll question is, how do you primarily get around? And you can select one of these 5 options: walk or roll in a wheelchair, a bike, public transit, personal vehicle, or other. And again, we'll give you some time to respond to that. That's how you primarily get around. Now, a lot of us use many of these, if not all of them, different times. And again, we'll give you a couple more seconds and close this and move to the next question after I share the results. Okay, in this case, 68% use personal vehicles, 20% bike, and 6% walk or wheelchair or public transit, and no one else said other. Okay, our next question is, have you ever ridden an e-bike? And so you have 3 options here: yes, and I own one; yes, but I don't own one; or no. So it'll be interesting to see where this comes out today. Again, we'll give you a couple seconds to respond. And thank you for responding to these. We'll close up this one. And for this, 49% no, but 51% yes. Of that, 33% yes, but don't own one, and 19% of you have or do own an e-bike. Okay. Final question here. Would you consider an e-bike for your primary commute? Yes, maybe, or no? Again, thanks to everybody for responding. And a couple more seconds for you. And again, this is for the primary commute, however that would work for you today. Okay. And in this case, 41% said yes, 33% said maybe, and only 26% said no. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carlton Reid to get us started today. Welcome, Carlton.
Hey there, interesting results there, actually. Positive results at the end of how many people want to get on e-bikes for their commute. That's fantastic to see that in action. Right, I'm going to try and share my screen because Michael's already told you who I am. I guess one thing I could actually add is I was also the founder and editor and publisher for a long time of bikebiz.com, which is the industry news site that might be pertinent. So I'm now going to share my screen. I believe, is it that one? What's new in Keynote? No. Play.
Yes, your screen is up, but you just need to exit that and go in full screen mode. There you go. Almost there.
You should have that now, yes?
Yes, you're good to go.
Cool. Okay, so there's the books that I wrote for Island Press, Bike Boom. I actually wrote that before there was a bike boom, so that was quite prescient. In that we had the pandemic bike boom, of course, which is sadly now tailed off a bit. And earlier than that, I wrote Roads Are Not Built for Cars, also for Island Press, and that was a book which basically described the beginnings of motoring and how you really wouldn't have motoring if you didn't have bicycling, and that's the technology, the money, the people, all sorts of things. You really wouldn't have modern motoring if you didn't have bicycling. And that's not just things like, the Good Roads movement. It's all sorts of other things. So that's like half of that book, all about motoring and not bicycling. But today, what I want to talk about is the history of e-bikes. So this particular machine, that's generally considered to be the world's first modern electrobike. And it's a Sanyo bike, and Sanyo demonstrated it at the Japan World Exposition Trade Fair, which was held in Osaka from March to September 1970. It was, of course, a concept machine and never really available to buy, but it actually encouraged other Japanese electronic companies to make their own versions, with e-bikes later made by Panasonic and quite a few others. However, the history of e-bikes goes back much further than 1970. In fact, almost as soon as bicycles were first developed in the 1860s and 1870s, bicycles and tricycles were fitted with motors and batteries. And we'll come back to this particular American gentleman later. Meanwhile, this is Englishman James Starley of Coventry, and he's considered to be the father of the bicycle. He didn't invent the bicycle, but he certainly popularized it. This is my photograph of his memorial in Coventry. Appropriately, it now stands next to a well-used cycleway heading to Coventry railway station. James was one of those to modify and improve the velocipede developed in Paris, France, in about the mid-1860s. He and others developed the high wheel bicycle, or penny farthing. To the left of Starley's head there, which is sadly missing its nose, is another of his innovations, and that's the Coventry lever tricycle of 1876. Look, keep an eye on that shape to see where it gets to. So a few years later, Frenchman Gustave Trouvé took this Starley tricycle and added batteries and a motor, making an early electric bike, but also, of course, it's the world's first electric car. So electric cars and electric bicycles developed together, not apart. Other innovators at the same time also had the reasonably obvious idea to exchange pedal power for battery power. English academics William Ayrton and John Perry added large lead-acid cells to another Starley tricycle to create their electric vehicle, introduced in 1881, which is pretty much the same year as Trouvé's vehicle, Trouvé's adaptation of Starley's tricycle. Now this is James Starley, the nephew of James Starley, and John Kemp Starley his name was shortened to JK. So JK Starley, he's the chap who in the mid-1880s developed the safety bicycle, a cycle with two equally sized wheels and a diamond frame, roughly the same bicycle we ride today. In 1888, JK Starley also made an electric trike. This is his vehicle. He had to test drive it in France because what became automobiles a bit later on were still illegal in Britain. Incidentally, J.K. Starley's bicycle was called the Rover safety bicycle, and his company became the Rover Motor Company, maker of the Range Rover. Rover is just one of 60 or so motor marques that had bicycling beginnings, as are revealed in Roads Were Not Built for Cars. Roads, where we're going, we don't need roads, said Dr. Emmett Brown to Martin McFly in the Back to the Future movie. And it appears that in 1885, G.P. Hackenberger of Austin, Texas, had the same idea because he believed that electric cycles might derive their power from overhead electric cables. Okay, that was a non-starter, but the development of the electric tricycle continued. Remember this guy? Is Albert Pope, father of the American bicycle industry and also one of the key figures in electric cars and bicycles. Pope's Columbia Bicycle Company was one of the first companies to make electric cars. Taking the Electrobat electric car of Pedro Salem and Henry Morris, developed in Philadelphia in 1894, Pope created one of the first commercial electric cars, which at that time was a direct competitor of gasoline-fueled cars. Who would willingly sit atop an explosion? Pope asked about cars powered by internal combustion engines. We now know, of course, that gasoline took over for both cars and motorbikes. But battery-powered vehicles appeared to be an evolutionary dead end, and development of them largely stalled. That is, until the fuel crisis of the 1870s, when Sanyo introduced that concept e-bike that I showed earlier. Many other battery-powered bicycles followed, but it wasn't until the 1990s that e-bikes started their quite amazing rise to prominence. And in some markets, I'm pretty much thinking of the Netherlands here and Germany, more than half of bike sales are now e-bikes, which, if you know the trajectory of bicycle sales and e-bikes, that's quite an amazing amount, considering just a few years ago we were thinking e-bikes were going to be pretty much a niche item. Absolutely not a niche item now. Now, many people believe that the pedal-powered bicycle will go the way of the dodo. Okay, maybe. And there's certainly terrific consumer demand for more torque, more power, more speed, and less pedaling. But what I've tried to convey today is that electric cars and bicycles developed side by side, and they share a surprisingly long history. There's much talk from futurists and legislators that electric cars are the future, but it's more probable that, in cities at least, the future belongs to e-bikes. And on that note, I leave you with this British ad campaign to get motorists to switch to e-bikes. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlton. That was wonderful. I am going to pick it up with the kind of the research side of current e-bike use. But I thought that was a wonderful history of the deep history of the e-bike.
Dillon, you're going to need to switch your screen.
Let's see.
On the display settings on top, we're seeing the outline slide.
Okay, let me just, oops. So you're seeing my main screen.
Yes, I think there's a way for you to switch it just in that one that you have, or make sure that you have the correct one selected. If you have multiple, you can swap screens if you need to.
Okay, can you tell me how to do that? Let's see, under
display settings.
Under display settings on the outline.
I see, screen. How about that? Is that better?
Yes, we're good. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So as I said, I'm going to pick it up with some research on the use of e-bikes now, and start with the idea that similar to what Carlton just suggested, that e-bikes are this sustainable transportation intervention, and that maybe there's room for electric cars. We know electric cars are going to be important. But I think a lot of people underestimate the potential for e-bikes. So let's see if I can advance the slides. So first, I wanted to just briefly mention the barriers to bicycling, because I think something that we all aren't really sure about is how much e-bikes break down these barriers. So there's now decades of research that shows that distance or time and safety are primary barriers to bicycling in many places around the world. And there are so many others, and we know from the history of transportation and land use planning that we've kind of put these in place. But it's been commonly stated by a bunch of researchers, including probably the leading researcher on bicycling, Professor Susan Handy here at UC Davis, that reducing travel distances and providing adequate environments for bicycling, they're absolutely needed, right? They're necessary, but not sufficient for bicycling to take place. So with those two as primary, I want to look a little bit about how e-bikes might break them down. So as an intervention, we think of e-bikes as effectively cutting the distance of travel, basically by increasing speed. So that's kind of what everyone comes to know about e-bikes in terms of use for daily travel. But for safety, it's a little unclear, and there's some hypotheses out there. So there's this potential to reduce risk by giving people the option to detour, right? So now that they can go a little bit faster, they can use that ability to get around safety hazards. There's also this potential to reduce risk at the micro level to avoid collisions. So quick acceleration is the one commonly seen in surveys. But then there's this downside, this potential to increase risk because of increased speeds. And so more research is needed on that. And probably what's going to be needed is infrastructure that's particularly designed for faster speed bicycling. But there are other barriers that e-bikes could potentially break down. Sweatiness is commonly a barrier reported in surveys for bicycling. And of course, you can exert less on an e-bike if you want. And then the ability to carry more cargo. Bikes are often seen as limited in their comparison to cars. And we've now seen with this plethora of e-bikes out there that electric cargo bikes can carry a lot of stuff. So potentially breaking that barrier as well. So in thinking as e-bikes as this kind of intervention to reduce driving and to change travel behavior, I'm going to step through 4 different projects that I've done recently. First is just a review of e-bike incentives, then talk a little bit about e-bike share and its implications, an example in the Sacramento region in California. Talk about employer e-bike lending with a case study of Google in Mountain View. And then finally circle back to this incentive idea with government e-bike rebates, some preliminary data. So in 2019, when the state of California was considering giving a rebate for the purchase of e-bikes, in the same year or the year following, the state of New York did the same thing, and now we see it all over the country, local level, state level, even there was some talk about it at the federal level. I decided to look at what's the evidence out there for e-bikes actually reducing car use, and what I found, mostly from gray literature of studies in Europe, but also some academic studies, is that there's quite a bit of evidence that suggests e-bicycling is more commonly substituting for car travel than conventional bicycling. And if I had to lump all that together and throw out some numbers, that's about 35 to 50% of e-bikes trips were replacing car trips in these studies, but it had dramatic ranges as low as 18, as high as 94%. This loosely relates to about a mile to 5 miles of vehicle miles reduced per day. That's for owners of e-bikes, or about 1 to 5% of personal VMT. But of course, in some programs that were targeted as in a program that sought car commuters and sought to change their behavior, not just someone who was given a rebate to buy an e-bike, those vehicle reductions were much greater. So a study showed 20% in Brighton and 33% reduction in Utrecht. So this is primarily from Europe because there hasn't been a lot of research on e-bicycling in the US. And at the time we wanted to study e-bicycling, there weren't a lot of people we could study. But we had one option, and that was we were getting an e-bike share in the Sacramento region in California. So this is a map of little old Davis. Is a it's a university town, very famous for bicycling infrastructure and culture, and surrounded by ag. And then just to the east is Sacramento and West Sacramento. And this electric bike share that launched in 2018 was the first in the region. It was the largest in the country at the time, about 900 bikes. This was pre-pandemic. It halted during the pandemic. And what we decided to do was survey residents before and after this e-bike share came, and also the users of the e-bike. And this is before we had relationships with micromobility operators and bike share operators. So just to give you an idea, this is a lot of on-the-ground work with hard workers, including my daughter, taping flyers to bike seats, trying to get people to participate in our research. And we got hundreds of people to participate in the user survey and thousands in the household survey. And what we found is for the e-bike share is there was a lot of car substitution, just like the research that suggests people that own e-bikes substitute cars. So if you add up the drive alone, blue, the orange for ride hailing and taxi, and the carpooling gray, you get a little over a third of trips that are substituting for the car. Of course, you get a third of the trips substituting for walking as well. And what we found is that all the short trips, or many of the short trips below 1.5 miles, are walk substituting. And then as soon as you get kind of over that threshold of about 1.5 miles, driving and ride hail substitution seems to be the predominant mode that e-bike share is replacing. So to put that in perspective for an entire system, a grad student, Tetsuya Fukushigi, built this incredible model that blended all our survey data from system level bike share data and regional travel data. And we built a model to estimate what was the per bike vehicle mile travel reduced per day. And we got to an estimate of about 2.8 miles. So for 900 bikes in the system, we're talking about 2,500 to 3,000 miles a day of car use reduction. Now that doesn't account for all the van miles that are used to rebalance these fleets, and because that data is not available. In San Francisco, they're collecting that data, and it seems to suggest that perhaps as much as half of this could be reduced by van miles. So more is needed to understand kind of the overall sustainability of micromobility services, including e-bike share, and we've got some ongoing studies to look at that. We also wanted to look at what the e-bike share did to household residents, and we knew this was a bit of a stretch, but we thought we'll just ask residents, randomly selected residents before and after the bike share, how much they're biking. So in this was a response to how many days did you bike in the past 7 days? And then the difference between the after and the before is what's plotted here, the distributions of these different cities. And we see that they're pretty much centered around the zero line. Davis, Sacramento, and West Sacramento all got the e-bike share. Natomas and other were people living outside the service boundary of the bike share. And we even see declines in biking in the Sacramento and West Sacramento region. So, which could be due to many other factors, but there's no clear jump in bicycling from the jump bike share that launched in 2018. So we knew that was a bit of a stretch because, of course, there's only 900 bikes and not everyone's going to try it, and it would be really hard. Probably the magnitude of the increase in bicycling is just hard to measure at the population level. So we also looked at other things, and that might change. And one of the most prominent things that changed was awareness. And this is a different sample. This is a sample of UC Davis campus travelers. So these are faculty, staff, and students that travel to UC Davis. It's a representative sample. And what we noted is that when we measured awareness of e-bikes, which is simply, do you know what an e-bike is? And consideration, that's some very similar question to what you answered in the poll in the beginning of this webinar, that before e-bike share, awareness was below 50%. 6 months after e-bike share, it had risen to above 60%, and then 18 months after, over 75%. So it's pretty clear that there's not a lot going on. There's some, of course, general awareness that's growing about e-bikes. That's, you know, a general background trend. But we took this to mean that, you know, having an e-bike share in your city is actually exposing a lot of people to the new mode. Now, when we asked about consideration, that jump is less clear, and it took a full 18 months to see any movement on people actually considering e-bikes for commute. And in our survey responses, commonly we hear a couple barriers for e-bicycling: cost and theft. So I wanted to jump quickly to some ideas to break those barriers down. So we think of micromobility services mostly as one-way shares, but there's really a lot more that can be done than one-way shares. And here are a bunch of examples of services that are not one-way shares that are much more like a lease. So these are bike as a service model, or basically a bike lease with a theft protection. And some of them may have a deductible, but you're kind of reducing that theft burden a little bit on the users. So it'll be interesting to track these services as they grow to see if this is an important way to get e-bikes out into the population. All right, let's jump a little bit to employer e-bike lending. Another way to kind of expose people to e-bicycling is to just give them bikes as a part of you know, a large employer's strategy for reducing car commuting. Sometimes employers have requirements to reduce peak travel from congestion. Others, they have sustainability goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. E-bike lending is an option, and Google decided way back in 2015, long before e-bikes were a thing in the US, that e-bikes might be a way to help with their to help manage their car use to their two large campuses in Sunnyvale and Mountain View in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so recently what I did was I took all of their self-reported commute data for program participants and tried to figure out what kind of effect this program had on bike commuting. So the program has quite a long, twisted history of being a pilot in 2015, making permanent, adding conventional bikes with e-bikes, doing these hosted events, giving, after 6 months of participation, giving people $300 to go purchase their own e-bike, and after they're, you know, have shown they can stick with it. And then part of compliance to stay in the program was to bike 60% of the time. Now that's still through self-reported data though, not tracked data. So with a bunch of data wrangling and modeling, we ended up concluding that bicycling rose dramatically for these program participants from less than 25% to over 60%. So meeting the goal on average, not satisfying the goal for every participant. But then after the program, there was a bit of a dip. And that's because not all participants took that incentive and bought their own bike and continued biking. And so because of this result, Google now has the program is extended indefinitely. So you can choose to take that incentive and buy your own bike, or you can just stay in the program, keep the leased bike at no cost to you, and continue as long as you continue reporting that you're biking to campus. So this is something that, you know, Google has been doing, and other employers are now learning that this could be an option for their own employees. So what does this mean on a, you know, a simple metric? That people that participated were increasing their bicycling commuting by, you know, about 2 days per week, and in the case for this geography, about 8.5 to 10.5 miles per week. So we didn't calculate downstream benefits, but you can imagine the physical activity benefits are probably the largest of all the potential benefits here. And we also modeled the single occupancy vehicle commuting, and we noted that it was almost a one-to-one exchange. So all of this bicycling was replacing single occupancy vehicle commuting, and that's how the program was designed to target SOV commuters. And lastly, I wanted to share some very preliminary data on recipients of e-bike rebates in California. So we have been studying these 3 rebate programs. One that occurred in Redwood Coast Energy Authority up in Northern California, one in Peninsula Clean Energy in the San Mateo region of the Bay Area, and then Contra Costa. And they all differ in their incentive strategies, but I'll point out a few key things. One is that Peninsula Clean Energy, their incentive are all for low income status, 400% below the federal poverty limit. And they give a large incentive up to $800 or 80% of e-bike price, and capped at but the e-bike itself is capped at $1,800. So these are not high-end e-bikes. Contra Costa took a different approach where they split 2 incentives, one for low income status, so that's $300 with a price of up to $5,000 for the e-bike, and only $150 for people that didn't satisfy the low income status. And then Redwood Coast kind of in between the 2 of those. So in surveying these participants or these recipients of the incentives, we asked some very basic travel behavior questions. So this is all post rebate because we don't have before measures. But if we looked at their primary travel mode, we see that they're still primarily traveling by electric or gas-powered cars. But almost 15% of the survey participants were reporting e-bike as their primary mode. So that's pretty substantial, considering that it probably is replacing a lot of driving. When we asked specifically about car replacement, over 80% said they had replaced a car trip with an e-bike trip at some point. And when we look at the frequency, we see it's most commonly about 1 to 3 times per week. So it's rare that people are replacing their car trips daily, but they're, a few times a week is more common. Now, this kind of flies in the face of some other evidence that we have. So when we asked people about the trip purposes that they make, recreation, shopping, and social kind of rise to the top. But then when we asked on their last trip what the share of those purposes were, recreation just dominates. And this is quite surprising. And it's surprising, well, it's surprising in one respect in that this hasn't been reported in other research on e-bicycling, even in the US. But this is all during the COVID pandemic. And so this could all be an anomaly due to people using their e-bikes for recreation during COVID. So we don't really know. We'll have to follow up with these participants in the future to see if this continues, if recreation is a dominant form of their use of e-bike, or not, if they're using it for destination-oriented travel, which is what's been observed in most of the literature thus far. When asking about the benefits and barriers, a good alternative to car is what people are saying, but also good for recreation. So maybe it's got this dual purpose for these recipients, which is great because you can think of this mode as targeting all kinds of positive behavior, not just car reduction. In terms of barriers to using more, again, we see a lot of the same: vandalism and theft, and even things like cargo space, and then of course infrastructure is still a concern for e-bicyclists, just like it is for e-bicyclists. So quickly, what I'll kind of say to summarize is just that we see in the research that e-bikes do seem to be replacing driving more so than conventional bikes. For shared e-bikes, they seem to have a similar car replacement, but we know shared services have shorter trip distances. So the potential, and they have all this problem of rebalancing fleets with vans, and they have the problem of only being really useful in dense areas. So shared services that we know of as one-way shares are not gonna get e-bikes out there. That people need to either own them or lease them, probably to make it work, especially in sprawling land uses that we have in the US. We found evidence that free e-bike lending for employers were highly effective for increasing bike commuting. But we also found that in these recipients of rebates are using e-bikes a lot for recreation, which of course the rebates are not designed for that. They're particularly designed to reduce car use. Well, we're not sure if this is COVID related or not. And then I would be remiss by not speaking to the fact that COVID has spurred this huge growth in e-bike sales, and we're going to start studying what this means for bicycling as a normal mode of travel. But in the preliminary data that we have and panel data that tracks people's bicycling over time, it seems to have been at most a little bump, and bicycling levels are kind of flattening out. So much more to say about that in the future. So with that, I will hand it over to Andrew.
Thank you, Dillon. That's absolutely wonderful. There's some really great points you were making there. Let's see if I can manage to pull up my screen. Okay, are we all seeing this now? I think we're all there. So yeah, thanks, Dillon. That was great. It was good to see some of those points you brought up there. I might have a couple of things to say about one or two of those later, but we'll get on to that. Oh, and thank you, Carlton, as well, for the great history of e-bikes. For our own part in this, IGO's story comes in around about 2006, where we were among the first people to be delivering commercial e-bike technology to North America. At the time, e-bikes were still little more than standard bike frames with motors and batteries just bolted on wherever they could. And if we go back to what things were like back in those days, you'll see that maybe aesthetically it wasn't the best thing that we'd ever come out with, but it was a good starting point. It was getting people where they wanted to be. Now, although the concept is still the same, essentially, the application and technologies have developed immensely over the last few years. Motor power and performance is definitely more efficient and fluid on more recent bikes. The technology has developed a long way. Battery capacity is continually improving. We're seeing this in all of the EV section, and it is a massive growth area. Trying to make these batteries smaller in size, lighter weight, and higher capacity is always a goal that people are striving for. The controllers within the bikes, this is what gets everything moving and working together. They've become much more intelligent, permitting greater interaction with the devices and the ability to self-diagnose system performances. Moving forwards, we're still looking at the emergence now of Bluetooth connections and how this brings the connectivity to the next level within these bikes. So the mobile device can actually become the center of operation, where you can control performance, you can map your rides, get directions, communicate directly with the manufacturers for support, assistance, and even interact in social groups where you can post your stories, experiences, photos of your rides. It's become a much more interactive experience, a lot of fun for everybody to get involved in. Not to mention motors becoming less obtrusive, battery integration into the frame, and generally making e-bikes much more visually appealing. Certainly hasn't helped the image, or hasn't hindered the image, I should say, of e-bikes in the marketplace. It is interesting to view the shifting acceptance of e-bikes in society, and as Carlton mentioned, and I think Dillon as well, that it was only as little as 4 or 5 years ago, e-bikes were the outsiders in the cycling industry. But as you can see, and the e-bike industry is now in growth. I think I can actually pull back some of Carlton's own facts for him in an article from Forbes, where he was stating that e-bike sales, this was back in 2020, was going to grow from 3.7 million to 17 million per year by 2030. And this was predating the rush for the pandemic. So I think that the actual growth was starting slightly before the pandemic. This is true, and it is interesting to see how over the last few years, the acceptance of e-bikes has jumped immensely. It's interesting to actually see where this area of growth has started to originate. The traditional market for e-bikes had always been seen as a retirement age rider, somebody over 55 with more time on their hands. They're riding for leisure. Maybe they needed that little bit of assistance. Although this still holds steady as a major segment of the market, there is little growth here. the majority of the market growth is starting to come from the younger demographic. These are the commuters, the families looking for a more environmentally friendly option than car dependency. They're looking for options for a healthier lifestyle, a less expensive option than having a second car. To these people, it's the freedom of movement and an alternative to the additional cars, which is the attractive aspects of e-bikes. And what was once very recently seen as an aid for less abled riders or as a cheating tool has very quickly been recognized for its ability to provide a wide range of people the opportunities to find sustainable balance for their lifestyle, good health, and all the while being conscious of their personal impact on the environment. Among some of the benefits of cycling in general, we can be looking at the fact that these vehicles, these bikes, they're much more easy to maneuver than a car or a van. This can help you access areas that are impassable. So the car would be stuck in a traffic jam. You'd be sitting there for hours. On a bike, you have the option to walk it down a path. You can take a separate route. It is great for relieving congestion around city hubs. E-bikes have this hop-on, hop-off convenience, as I mentioned, and in a city, bike riders are more likely to stop to visit stores. And there are studies where streets and commercial areas have been blocked off to traffic. And initially, the store owners were concerned about this, but in time they came to realize that their sales actually increased because of the cyclists and the pedestrians that had more access to their stores. E-bikes and cycling in general is not restrictive to a schedule such as public transport, which does allow the rider the freedom to move where and when they want at their own pace, which is a major advantage. To the actual individual, an e-bike can offer a lot of additional privileges over the top of a standard cycle. They are a very efficient mode of transport. For shorter journeys, they are much more efficient than an than a gas or diesel vehicle, or even a hybrid electric car, excuse me. And this is in part due to the e-bikes being considerably lighter than cars and having a more efficient power transfer system, which requires less power to travel the same distance. The traveling greater distance is an advantage for riders that could let me start that again. To be able to travel greater distances is a great advantage for the riders. And this is something that they wouldn't necessarily have been able to comfortably achieve on a non-electric bike. So this opens up more of the local area and increases the distance that somebody can travel to their local amenities without having to be dependent upon a car. It does actually turn out that e-bikes are used more often than non-electric bikes. If somebody is owning an e-bike, the studies that I've seen, and I have provided some links at the end of this article, do seem to show that owning an e-bike has a tendency to encourage people to get onto that e-bike rather than rely on going back to a car, even if they own a bicycle as well. It's also interesting to notice that physical and mental health both have benefits. The physical benefits of an e-bike are to do with the workout. A lot of people seem to want to discuss that bicycles are providing a workout, and e-bikes, we get back to the same story of them being a cheat. Well, this doesn't actually hold true. In the studies, it does seem to show that people with e-bikes seem to maintain the same level of physical activity because they expend longer times on the bike, and it is a much more sustained style of exercise as opposed to the peaks and troughs you get on a non-electric bike. This can be very good for cardiovascular health. It is also an amazing benefit for heart health because you can maintain a consistent level of intensity, and it's always good for muscle tone. Some people also find that the mental benefits of taking a bike ride are immensely important to them. It's a time that they use to clear their thoughts, to reduce stress. And as you're cycling, it's tending to regulate your breathing, which leads to improved quality of sleep in many cases. For the environment, e-bikes have a huge advantage. They are zero-emission vehicles. They're propelled by a combination of human and battery power with no reliance on gas or diesel to run, and they release no harmful carbon emissions. They're able to reduce air pollution. So the increased e-bike use in place of car travel in and around a city core will greatly reduce the buildup of smog for an experience which can lead to the health and well-being of everybody in the area. And anybody that's ever been to London, Carlton, I'm hoping you'll back me up on this, will know that in the past, you would come out there, your nose black and your fingers feeling dirty. And I think that's changing recently with the introduction of cycling. Infrastructure repair is also something to take into account here. Bicycles are a lightweight vehicle and electric bikes also. This causes less wear and tear on the road surfaces than cars and vans. So the road surfaces, which are not the most eco-friendly substances, require less maintenance, and the infrastructure will last longer. So there's less cost to the community for repair, but it also reduces the use of the heavy machinery which is required to perform these tasks. Going back to my point above here as well, there's noise pollution. Obviously, less cars, a lot happier people around, because the noises from the cars can actually affect people's health. And it's found that moving away from an area of high intense noise and having an area which is maybe a pedestrianised area does have a calming effect and helps people's mental health a little. And the last section here is the low carbon footprint. Using vehicles that do not emit carbon byproducts is one of the best ways to ensure a greener environment. They are an effective tool in the struggle to reduce the effects of global warming, and studies have shown that switching to electric bike transport can reduce our carbon footprint by up to 50%. Bike Radar, which is an online authority on bikes and cycling gear, they actually set out to find how green cycling actually is. They compared cycling, both electric and non-electric, to other forms of transport, and they took into account manufacturing and even factoring in the human calorie intake to make sure they got a full comprehensive view of the comparisons. Unsurprisingly, cycling in general proved better than car and electric car performance, but the twist was that e-bikes proved better than non-electric bikes and also produced less CO2 than simply walking. And this is mostly due to the e-bike motor being a more efficient machine than the human body. If anybody doesn't believe me about this, please take a look at my links at the end of this, this presentation, and you can read through this yourself and just go over the facts and the figures. It's quite an eye-opener. So, e-bikes are great for the body, the community, the environment, but what are the limitations of e-bikes? What about shopping? How much can you carry? Taking the kids to school, and what happens when it snows? Many people will point to Europe, where talking about such a successful move to cycle culture, and from their example, we can see that yes, electric bikes are quite capable of taking on all of these tasks. However, there is a level of personal comfort and convenience that each person wants to maintain. Using Europe as an example, it is possible to see how quickly using a bike to achieve most daily tasks has become not just acceptable, but simply part of the daily routine for many people. The use of cargo bikes for families is starting to gain traction in North America, but it's still very far behind the way it is used in European cities. Many delivery companies have already started to take advantage of e-bike technology to reduce costs and increase efficiency. Fat bikes, like the one you're seeing on the screen at the moment, can be used almost all year round, even in locations such as our base here in Montreal, where winters bring heavy snow. Snow removal from the bike paths is part of the city schedule during the winters, which is very important to note that it is the city that is taking the guiding direction to make sure that it is accessible for cycles during the colder months. So cycling in general is ideally suited for local travel and tasks. E-bikes extend the range and capabilities of this form of transport. E-bikes can help promote a healthier and more sustainable lifestyle when used in place of a car. So now we get on to the big problem, the cost. E-bike prices are dramatically variable. They can be found for under $1,000 and can easily exceed 10 times this price. So what is a reasonable price and why? It is generally considered that the very, very low cost e-bikes may be compromising on components and build quality to maintain their price and should be approached with caution. It doesn't mean you won't find a bargain, but just do your homework. Always be sure to check these bargains very carefully. If the bike is in the range of around 2,000 plus, it is much more likely to be fitted with durable and reputable parts. If you consider the e-bike as a replacement for purchasing a second car, then it is easily the less expensive of the two vehicles. The purchase price of an e-bike is a fraction of the cost of a car, and many e-bike companies do now offer the option of monthly payments to make that initial purchase more manageable. The upkeep and maintenance is minimal on a bike and can mostly be done by the bike owner. At IGO, we've developed our e-bikes with serviceability features to reduce dependency on trained mechanics for even more advanced servicing. Charging an e-bike costs only a few cents and has better efficiency per mile than the heavier electric cars. This is also considerably less expensive than any gas or diesel powered vehicle. Now, the mechanical components of an e-bike are the same as you would find on any non-electric bike, and good quality durable components will cost the same on either type of bike. As the technology evolves, the costs of the electrical components has tended to drop, making e-bikes more affordable. An example of this is the motor technology. The hub motor technology has been around much longer than mid-motor technology. It has become a much more affordable option over time. With a lower price tag, the hub motor solution has become an accessible option to a vast number of riders, and this technology can be an advantage to many, not just because of the price. Hub motor e-bikes are more suitable for quick trips and the simplicity of movement. These are often equipped with a speed sensor, and this determines the engagement of the motor based on the cadence, which is the speed of the pedal movement. They require little thought to use, and they can be perfect for safe commuting or leisure use for even someone with very little prior riding experience. On the other hand, a mid-motor e-bike generally works with torque sensors, and the amount of pressure placed on the pedal determines the amount of assist delivered by the motor. The feel of this is closer to the feel of a standard non-electric bicycle. Correct use of gears and knowledge of basic cycling skills will optimize this experience, and this style is therefore popular with people who have more experience with cycling. Although mid-motors with torque sensor technology tend to still carry a higher price tag, it is possible to develop the hub motor e-bikes with a torque sensor, such as the IGO Aspire bikes that I'm showing you right now. These can combine the responsive pedaling experiences with a lower cost hub, and this tends to give that responsive feel at a lower cost to the consumer. Each battery motor system also requires a controller and a human interface to adjust and regulate the electric systems within these e-bikes. Controller development is crucial to the performance of the e-bikes, and every respectable company spends a lot of time and effort perfecting these settings individually for each of their bike models. This is one of the reasons why we get to the next point, which is cost of an e-bike does make it essential for somebody wanting to get an e-bike to test ride first. It is very important to know that the bike you're looking at is a good feel for you. With so much variety, it's very important to ensure that the bike that you're looking at and the one you want to ride is suitable for your conditions and suitable for your needs. So, So much possibility, so much to consider. Are there regulations to ensure everyone is safe? Well, I'm glad we got onto this. Yes, there are regulations that have been in place since around 2008. These define the different classes of bike. And each of these categories of electric bike have their own guidances. These regulations are, so let me just get on to, here we go. So the class 1 regulation. Class 1 bikes are pedal assist motors with maximum assist speed of 32 kilometers an hour or 20 miles an hour. The class 2 bikes are very similar. The only difference is these add a throttle, which allows the person to give a boost of power to move them out of the situation. And the class 3 bike has a throttle or it has pedal assist. And the motor assist on that pedal assist has no higher assist speed than 45 kilometers an hour. That's 28 miles per hour. All of these classes must fit within the regulations of having a maximum motor power of 750 watts in the US or 500 watts in Canada. Now, many states and provinces also have additional restrictions limiting the use of class 3 electric bikes on public roads. A lot of trails are also restricted of class 3 bikes. Age restriction for riders of e-bikes is also dependent on the state and the province. These regulations, although having been in place for a long time, have been flaunted in recent years by some manufacturers. Even at IGO, we do regularly get requests for people to jailbreak their controllers so that they can change the speeds. And we have to turn these people down because the regulations are designed to maintain safety for the users and for the people in proximity of these e-bikes. Good manufacturers take a lot of time to ensure their products work well and are safe when performing within their tested parameter sets. And ensuring these parameters stay within the regulation is an important aspect of an electric bike. Recent announcements have made it clear that the regulations are going to be enforced much more strictly in the coming years. The regulation categorized e-bikes into these 3 groups, and we're going to start seeing a lot more focus on ensuring that bikes within these categories are only used within the areas permitted. It's interesting to then bring up what happens with regard to homebrew electric bikes, people that you can buy the kits. Now, kits for bikes is an enthusiast's way of putting a bike together. Somebody who enjoys tinkering and somebody that has technical ability may be able to do this well, but it should be approached with caution. You do need to know what you're doing if you're going to be putting a kit onto a bike. One thing to consider is that non-electric bikes are not necessarily built to withstand the torque that is applied when a motor pushes a bike forwards. So frame failure can be a problem. Electric bikes have been designed and tested to make sure that the torque is inside the range of their abilities. We do hear a lot about batteries as well and how batteries can be dangerous. Again, batteries on electric bikes, a good quality cell from a Samsung, LG, Panasonic, big name brands. A reputable e-bike company will have already found these for you and they will be part of your build. When you're building your own bike with a kit, you have to be very careful and make sure you don't go for the cheap no-name brands because these might not be tested as well as the Samsungs or the LGs. Now, when we're talking about batteries, one of the problems we hear about is recycling batteries. This is a problem globally, but this year saw the industry move forwards with a national-wide program with Call to Recycle to coordinate and manage e-bike battery recycling, including reclaiming much of the raw material to process into new batteries. There's claims of 95 to 98% of the materials within the battery can be reclaimed. We're proud to say that IGO is participating in this program. And as further development in the battery technologies continues, we're going to reduce the size and weight of these batteries and increase the efficiency as we go. So the current state of e-bikes provides options for all road users, for families and for businesses. The regulations are all in place to ensure that e-bikes can perform safely with other vehicles in a shared transportation infrastructure. The regulations are being enforced more strictly. Standardized testing and certifications are now being applied onto bikes. There's the UL testing, which is done to ensure that people can see which bikes have been through the testing process. But what about the future? How do we get more people onto these bikes? Price and incentives. Unfortunately, as I've mentioned, there has been a shortage of compensations around of the components across the cycling industry, which combined with the increased shipping costs seen in the last couple of years has caused a price increase in electric bikes. But at the same time, we are also seeing that the costs of technology are coming down, and with the efficient methods being developed, we can hope that the pricing will start to level off. Getting good quality parts and a durable bike is always an investment, and the old adage of buy cheap, buy twice certainly applies for this. Provincial incentives have been a great success here in Canada. In Laval, over the last years, $400 rebates were offered on any new purchase of an electric bike, and in Nova Scotia, much the same process, a $500 rebate on the purchase of a new bike. More involvement to help lower income houses overcome the initial pricing of moving into a system that has a lower long-term cost would always be an advantage. I know there is a federal bill for a tax rebate for electric vehicles trying to be passed at the moment. It would also be good to see more incentives at the state level, such as the ones that we saw in Laval and Nova Scotia. The servicing of e-bikes and the training of mechanics is a continual issue. There is a shortage of mechanics in the whole of the cycling industry at the moment, and there are some very good training programs out there. We actually work with a Montreal company called Cyclochrome, who train mechanics in not just the mechanical aspect of the bikes, but also the e-bike side of this. We have also reached out to a few of the other mechanic training systems and institutes throughout North America, and we hope to be able to work forwards with them to progress the knowledge of e-bikes in the industry. Community needs to build a platform that will encourage the transition to electric bikes. From this, I mean working with condominiums, for example, who not only require adequate safe storage for bicycles in new buildings, but also could provide bike sharing schemes within their condos as part of the amenities and services. Having municipalities setting a good example, work vehicles could very easily be transposed into e-bikes in many circumstances, whether it's a specialized cargo bike for some of the maintenance crews, or the simple use of e-bikes for the staff to move from one location to the other. I've spoken with some of the local municipalities around our Dorval area and Laval area here, and we have provided a few bits of guidance and hope that solutions for this transition can be coming through quite soon. We would hope to see this become more widely adopted across North America. A Canadian research paper delivered a blueprint of key actions that can increase cycling in the community in total. Increasing cycling in Canada, a guide to what works. And I've provided a link to that at the end of this presentation. It's very worth reading if you have the time. This gets me on to my final point, the safety. Safety and a safe infrastructure is key to the continued growth and sustainable transport, as a safe environment encourages more uptake. From within the industry, we can strive to ensure high standards of safety in the products we build, safety for the riders and those around them, adhering to the class definitions, the UL standardized testing and regulations, personal safety on a bike with good stopping power, including lighting and visibility to others with brake lights, the ability to assess surrounding surrounding vehicles and approaching vehicles, such as the Garmin system, which is coming into use. All of these are key for personal confidence and in the product and in its ability to safely be used. Safety is key to the adoption of cycling culture in North America. As e-bike manufacturers, we can help to increase safety of the rider with advanced onboard technology. But it is still required for a safe environment, the infrastructure for all to embrace the scale of change we would like to see for the benefit of local communities, of cyclists, of pedestrians. I hope this presentation was informative. I've tried to include as much as I could here, and I have provided a list of reference links at the end, which, if you have the time, are well worth reading through. And there's a lot to take in here. So if you would like to discuss any of these points any further, I will be monitoring the Twitter account. Please follow these steps. Go on and like iGo Electric on Twitter. That'll make me very, very happy. And if you want to reach out to us through this, make sure to mention iGo Electric and use the hashtag sustainable transport so that we can find what you're talking about and make sure that we can follow up with you. So I'd just like to thank you, and thank you for listening for sure. And I'd like to maybe hand you back now to Michael to get set up for the questions.
Great, thank you, Andrew, and thanks to everybody on the panel, as well as the many people who have submitted questions. So we're going to go into them directly here and have our panelists go ahead and turn their cameras on so you can see them during this portion of our presentation. We've gotten many, many questions, and they've fallen into a few different categories. And in fact, as it usually happens, questions come in as the presenters are talking, but then also we get a number of general questions as well. So, and I'll just kind of let Dillon know that we did get a number of questions for you relative to the research. So I may kind of go quickly through some of them as we move forward, based on the research and the data that you were sharing before, Andrew. But let me just start with this one, and we'll just move forward. And we may go over a little bit since we've gotten so many, maybe an extra 5-10 minutes beyond 2:30 Eastern. But for this one, from Jay Doborowski, asking, I would like to cycle to commute to work, but must use very busy roads with minimal bike lanes, and I don't have access to a shower. How do we make this infrastructure more available to the public? I don't know who wants to take that one or start with that one.
I could maybe just bring this up that this is a common problem. Here in Montreal, I am exceptionally lucky that we're in a city which has a very, very good infrastructure. I think it's been voted the top large city just recently for cycling infrastructure. It is a great advantage to have. That being said, when there isn't the infrastructure, it does make things very, very hard to be able to commute around. The best thing to be able to do for your own safety is to be able to be aware and to obviously wear the bright clothes. It's a sad thing to have to say that you have to take responsibility of safety on yourself. It is a good idea to maybe start petitioning, talk to the local councillors, bring up this aspect of a safer cycling infrastructure, which is going to be of a benefit to everybody in the community. I think that that is the best option. And as far as being sweaty when you get to work, get an e-bike. They're great.
Okay, did anybody want to add to that before we move on? Okay. Next one is, I guess, more of a comment. And I know, Andrew, as you were talking further along in your presentation, I think you talked a bit about the price and the cost of these bikes. But we did get a comment from Jim Brown who said, I'm sorry to hear so little about equity. Lower income communities have fewer bike shops or repair facilities and live in a more car-oriented area, but are more bike reliant. I'm thinking about single car homes. The emphasis on air quality benefits is only part of the story here. Is there a way or a direction that the industry is going to kind of address this more? How do we see this issue being evolving?
Well, as I pointed out, just being a cheaper product does not necessarily mean it's a better value product. So pointing people towards a lower cost bike wouldn't be necessarily my first option. I would say that in a long-term look at the situation, the ongoing cost does lower over time. It is the initial output which has often been the holdback for many, many people, especially in lower income situations. That is why I do see that a lot of different companies are offering the payments over time to try to ease that out over a long expanse. Ideally, I would like to see a lot more of the local municipalities and local governments get involved in finding ways to subsidize people's purchases, because they're, as I pointed out, the parts and the components on a bike, electric or non-electric, are very, very similar. The only difference is that you can walk into a big box store and find a very cheap bike, whereas an electric bike will often have the higher componentry on it, and that's where you see the disparity in the prices. You're less likely to find a very cheap frame with the higher spec components on them. So I think, again, if we can find some way to persuade the municipalities to see the advantage of investing in this infrastructure and in the advantage of getting people to move to a cycling culture, that is the way to try to bring in the incentives to buy electric.
I'll just add that so in the incentive programs that we were studying, equity is a huge component, and in one of them it was entirely to low-income residents. And I think the state of California now has a $10 million project that's going to incentivize e-bike sales starting next year. And they have two goals on that list: reduce greenhouse gas emissions and provide better transportation for transportation justice in the state of California. So I think we're going to see this blending of the goals beyond just as the question was stated, beyond air quality, but it's much broader socially than that. But I agree with Andrew that it's kind of the role of policy to make this happen.
Great, thank you. Carlton, do you want to add anything to that at all?
I'm all in favor of electric bikes. I'm on this panel, obviously. Andrew knows that I love him and his bikes. I've got to say, incentives, why are they only for e-bikes? I would be quite happy for incentives to be for bicycles. And that's all, not just bicycles, cycles of all sorts. So there is this slight risk of us of separating the two things, and that's quite dangerous to separate e-bicycling from bicycling. So I'd much rather see that brought back together again in incentive programs. So the important thing is to get people on bikes, whether that's e-bikes or non-e-bikes, acoustic versus all these kind of the fancy names for e-bikes and not e-bikes. So bikes is the important bit. The e bit at the front is great if you can afford it. If the incentives make that more affordable, absolutely fantastic. But let's not ignore the bit in front of the e, bikes.
I would absolutely agree with you there, Carlton. That is a wonderful point to put across. The only addition I would make to that is the e part of that e-bike does expand the range of the community. So bringing in electric bikes provides the community a greater expanse. So somebody can travel to their local store, and that local store is much further away now. This is the one advantage that e-bikes do have over the standard bikes, as you say, over the mechanical. And I do totally agree, though, that I would love to see everybody moving on to any kind of bike. Bikes are great. Let's do it.
Okay, thanks, Andrew, and everybody. So we'll move on here. So I got several questions in, I guess, about, generally speaking, conflicts between e-bikes and other bicycles, or conflicts between e-bikes and pedestrians, and how communities are managing that. So I'll start with this one from Dave Anderson, who says, I've found that some of the biggest oppositions to e-bikes coming from the existing bike advocates who don't want them in their space. E-bikes are one of these emerging trends where transportation innovation straddles the line between modes. for example, BRT, Uber, and other electric micromobility. What are your thoughts as to how we think about transportation when our discrete model silos start to blur? I don't know who wants to take that first.
If I can just point out, I've got this lovely bike behind me right here. This is my old road bike when I was working back at Guru. It's a carbon bike. If I get on that and I go down the road, I'm doing well over 35 kilometers an hour, which is faster than the maximum speed you get on an electric bike. You'll often find the people in their race gear going along the roads, going very, very fast. So the idea that electric bikes in themselves are faster is not necessarily the whole story here. You'll find that electric bikes do give the ability to have a consistency of speed, and I think this is where people have the problem with them. So an electric bike traveling on the road means that that person can keep a consistent speed, and people find that that might make them feel a little distracted on the bike. And I think this is where the problem comes in, and people see there could be an issue. This comes down to something which I know there's a couple of different bike stores around which are trying to address this, which is about the etiquette of how to share a road, training people in all walks of life as to how to use the tools that they have. And to me, this is the solution. You learn the tool that you have. It doesn't necessarily need to be the same as a driving test, but back in England, we have the cycling proficiency when you're young. This is a wonderful thing to do. You learn the best way to deal with situations. And I think with electric bikes, that is just the same. You see a lot of this on mountain bike trails. The electric bikes on mountain bike trails have been a big area of dispute for many places. And it turns out that a lot of people use the electrical assist on a mountain bike to get up to the top of the mountain. It just makes it a little easier to get back up to the top. They're still pelting down at the same speed as the people on the non-electric bikes and having as much fun without the electrics on for that section. There's a lot of discussion as to how electric should be used and what its effect is on the environment and how it affects the people that you're surrounding. But I think it does still come down to, let's work out the etiquette. Let's work out how we can all share a road together. And again, let's make sure the infrastructure is there to support multiple forms of transport.
I'll add to that from Andrew in that we don't seem to complain about cars and motorists traveling that fast, and here we are complaining about e-bikes going fast. However, that said, we have got to recognize that these three classes in the US model, we haven't got those classes in the EU or the UK. We basically have mostly that class 1, and in the UK and in the EU it's 15.5 miles per hour, where everything above that, when you're watching on your speedometer on your handlebars on your electric bike, everything above that is you pedaling. So it's not the class 1, it's not the EU style bicycles that are probably the problem, because as Andrew said, a road bike can easily, consistently do those kind of speeds. However, there is an enormous amount of illegal use of bicycles that really, e-bicycles that really shouldn't be on the road. In fact, where I live in Newcastle, Northern England, outside my window, in fact, I'm now getting regularly, almost every night, about 5 or 6 electric, and I consider them motorbikes, because these guys are not pedaling, and they come past incredibly fast. I mean, I'm talking 40, perhaps even 50 miles an hour, shooting over the hill here. And the potential is what are very much illegal e-bikes, in effect motorbikes, are going to bring the whole sector down. So the industry really needs to be much more proactive in wanting to take these e-bikes out of the market. Partially it's rogue retailers. There are many retailers are selling these bicycles. Partly it's consumers, as Andrew said in his talk before, they're chipping or taking the chips out of these bicycles to make sometimes them go faster than they are legally allowed to do. But I'm going to caveat all that with what I said to begin with, in that even the fastest of these e-bikes are still not going as fast as a normal car on the streets. So yes, it's a potential problem. Speed in general is a problem of all modes, apart from that poor pedestrian. When I'm a pedestrian, I can do 4 or 5 miles an hour. everybody else who's faster than me it bugs me, and I'm worried about anybody going faster than me, and that's on a bicycle, in a car, on an e-scooter. So there's your basic problem.
Okay, thank you. And I guess along these lines, we did receive a question from Thomas Craighead, who was asking, is there been any research done, or at least some initial thoughts about the safety issues that are uniquely related to e-bikes over manual bikes? Do we know if anything's going on yet?
Yeah, yeah, there are some researchers studying e-bike safety. I think some of it is perceived safety, as I was mentioning in my talk. This recognition that you know, there's a hypothesis in bike literature that perceived safety kind of parallels actual safety. It's yet to be really vetted, but I think e-bikes are a good test of that hypothesis, because we have seen in the literature that perceived safety is actually better than a conventional bicycle, surprisingly, maybe, when we know that people are generally traveling faster on their e-bike than they would on their bike, except with the exception of recreational cycling. And so, you know, I think there's I don't really know what the answer is in terms of crash numbers, and I don't think anybody knows yet. Maybe there are some countries that have been tracking it, but we've in the U.S. we haven't. We actually, I was a part of a group to put e-bikes as a code in the trauma registry, because it turns out they're not in our trauma registry. And so we finally we tried to do this years ago, and we got e-bikes are now in the motorcycle class, so you can't differentiate an e-bike trauma from a motorcycle trauma. And so we ended up having to put it in the motorcycle class. We couldn't get it in the bike class because the bike definition was too strict, had to be human powered only. And so now there's going to be, going forward in the US trauma registry, the ability to differentiate an e-bike from a motorbike, but it's going to be in the motorcycle class. So it's still going to take some training to track. So hopefully in the years following, we'll be able to finally track at least the poor safety, the safety outcomes. But other countries may be further ahead. I'm not sure.
Thanks, Dillon. So I'm going to follow up with you on a couple questions regarding your research that we received while you were presenting. The first one here is from Laura Stutinsky, who was asking, can you say more about the pros and cons of long-term lease ownership versus shared e-bikes? And did you say that the lease own is the more effective option?
This is a hypothesis, but I think in the U.S. and in many non-dense urban areas, yeah, a lease or an owned e-bike makes a lot more sense, because a shared service I have yet to see a shared service operate in a suburb, and we have so many suburbs. So whether it's owned or leased, I think they operate the same. Like the user behavior is almost identical. The only advantage of the lease is basically theft protection, and there may be other ways to protect your bike with insurance, right? So in the US, Vehicle Assurance offers e-bike insurance, but that's the only real difference. But maybe maintenance costs too. So maybe there are some other benefits. There are these emerging services of, we do everything for you, right? You have a flat tire, we come and fix it. So maybe that's important too. But otherwise, yeah, I think the personal own or lease is going to be much more impactful than a shared service, just given the broader range it can be used.
If I could also just maybe add in, I know that using our hometown here as Montreal as an example, we do have the Bixi scheme, which is the ride share scheme. And I know that a couple of years ago, maybe it was just last year or the year before, they did start bringing in electric bikes into their service as well as the standard bikes. Now, the last years, they blew everybody away. Every bike was being used consistently. As you say, this was in a very dense hub. So that is a perfect place to use it. If we look at where they take their ride scheme to, it stopped just before our office, and we're just slightly out of the center of the town. And you can see that they've obviously decided what is the area of maximum usability for these bikes. And I think it does back up what you're saying there, but in a dense area, it can be great to have share schemes. And it makes sense. Even the car share schemes were something that were working quite well for a while. With a bicycle share scheme, it's much easier to get from one place to the other. I think I might have a link actually in my in the end of my slides, which takes some information about this, where it was showing that over the time they had the electric bikes and the standard bikes, they saw that the person that checked the stats there seemed to be thinking that it looked like the electric bikes were being taken out for leisure rides, and the non-electric was still just being used for commuting. There was almost a break in the two different uses for the styles of bike, which is very interesting, and maybe that's something that could be looked into as well. But even in a central hub, there are different uses, and I know in Montreal we do have a nice big hill, so I'm surprised that people are still using the non-electrics to get up that. But I'm thinking somewhere like San Francisco, maybe the electric bike for a city commute could be a little bit more useful.
Okay, thank you. I guess another question here for you, Dillon, at least to start. Are you aware of any work being done to integrate bike plus modes into regional travel demand models? My MPO did some rough micromobility scenarios, but ultimately we didn't have the data to justify implementing any change to the model.
Yes, so let's think. So San Francisco, well, let's see, SFCTA did this many years ago. They developed this app called Cycle Tracks, which allowed participants to record their routes and use it, and they used that to develop a bike route choice model, and then they integrated that with their travel demand model. Now it's not necessarily regional; it's just the city, which is the county of San Francisco. But that's probably the best example that I can think of. Other MPOs, MPOs that have shifted away from the 4-step to the activity-based models should have bike modes. Bike should be a choice in their discrete choice models now. So it is hard to get the data, and hopefully cities and regions recognize the importance of count programs. I'm doing some research on that as well, and not only count programs but also travel surveys and diaries to understand travel behavior. But yeah, I mean, it's going on. I don't know how pervasive it is, though.
Okay, thank you. Here's a more general question from Jen Ferris, who's asking, what are some of the unique challenges that e-bikes may introduce to infrastructure design, and how can these challenges be overcome?
It's a good question.
Yeah, many thinkers in if you go to somewhere like VeloCity, you know, the conference for bicycles, you will hear people like Philip Christ from the OECD talking about multimodal lanes. So in effect, micro-mobility lanes. So maybe in the future we won't be thinking of them. We're not calling them as bicycle lanes. It'll be, there's going to be a whole bunch of different products coming up in the future, and potentially that might be stratified on speed. So in the Northern American example, where you do have these different classes of e-bike and faster forms of micro mobility, and I'm thinking very small cars as well, which would potentially even now fit into the bike lanes of the Netherlands. You'll see these micro cars pootling along. There potentially might have to be just those different kinds of lanes. So maybe there'll be a sidewalk, what we call in the UK a pavement. I know that's confusing to people who call pavement the road, but anyway, sidewalks. Then you're going to have a bike lane maybe for in effect slower bikes, and then you're going to have this micro mobility lane. Now in certainly in the US, you've got tons of room. you can do this. You know, in Europe, we might not have the roads that can normally fit a whole bunch of lanes, but in the Northern American example, you've got lots of room to be able to stratify your roads and have it so you've got different classes of vehicle. How that will work is going to be difficult, because in the Netherlands, where clearly they're pretty advanced on these kind of things, they're in effect getting rid of the faster motorized vehicles. So they're called brommers, they're kind of the mopeds. They're trying to get rid of those from the traditional bike path. But this is a future thing. I think we're going to have to look at what forms of stratification we're going to need protected lanes in the future for all the different forms of micromobility we know are either here or are coming.
I would also like to add that I think if anybody has the time, if they look through Increasing Cycling in Canada, a guide to what works, I think that, if I remember correctly, that does cover some of the aspects with examples of how infrastructure has been put into place, I think in places like, I think there's somewhere in the West Coast and possibly Toronto as well, and how that has dealt with the systems of different vehicles into areas. It also covers the aspects of climate, giving the example of Montreal, where it gets very, very cold in the winter, but still we get the people cycling.
Great, thank you. Next question here is from Casey Barrett, who asks, e-bikes have the huge potential to be a sustainable transport climate solution, but to be truly sustainable, they can't contribute to e-waste at the end of their life cycles. Are e-bikes part of the circular economy? And if not, what can be done to address that?
Well, I think as I mentioned in my presentation, the battery is always going to be the biggest problem. In any of these vehicles, in any electric vehicle, we have to find a way to make sure that the battery is as recyclable as possible, is reclaimable. And as I said, it's call to recycle there is working with us. We're working within the industry. I believe it's not just Canada, it is the US as well. And the aim is to reclaim as much from used batteries as possible, reuse it, and make sure that we're keeping the device as sustainable as we possibly can.
The electric car industry is a bit more advanced than bikes on this front, in that, like, if you get a Nissan car, certainly in Japan, it's coming to the US and it's coming to Europe, they will strip out the batteries from that e-car, because their electric cars batteries are only like 60, even when you think it's completely dead, they're only 60% depleted in reality. So they strip them out and then they put them into storage devices, so they're collecting power from solar power and collecting the energy that way. So there needs to be much more modular stuff carried out. So obviously Nissan can do that only with Nissan cells. So there needs to be more industry cooperation to maybe get standards where these things can be done across a whole industry. And the bike industry is definitely slow at doing similar stuff, so that the electric car industry is much, much more advanced than the bike industry. That doesn't mean to say that the bike industry shouldn't be doing this. It absolutely should be doing this. I don't think that they've done much to date. There's been a bit of recycling talked about by the big brands, the Specialized, the Treks of this world. I don't see any or very much on the ground actual recycling programs. It's mainly lip service at the moment, and that's got to change.
Yes, I do agree, and that's why I'm really hopeful for this Call to Recycle program, which seems to be industry-wide. And it is trying to involve all of the different bicycle manufacturers. If you go to their site, you'll see a list, and it isn't just the Specialized and Treks. Thankfully, a lot of people are signing up for this, and I think rightly so. This is a very important step forward. It's also worth remembering that electric bicycles, the batteries, you're looking at a lifespan of probably at least 5 years before you start even considering the battery powers dropping. You get around 750 cycles before you start seeing any droppings. The cells inside a battery can be replaced. It is possible. There are services out there that will be able to replace them and update your battery, as opposed to needing to throw away the old one and buy a new one. But as you say, these are very, very individual cases. And the idea for the call to recycle, which is an industry-wide recycling program, is a great move in the right direction. I'm really hoping that this year, when we're starting to see this pick up, we really do start seeing it progressing well, because with an increase in electric cycling comes the increase in a few years' time of that recycling that needs to be done.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I know we've already gone a little bit over, but I'd like to ask a few more questions before we get to closing thoughts, given the volume of questions we've gotten today. And again, thanks to everybody who have sent them in. We will share all the questions with the panelists, and you also have the option of contacting them directly. So here's one from Jennifer Ray, who says, when looking at e-bikes for daily commute options, what has been the standard commute length in distance and or commute time that e-bikes can be it's still considered a viable option? And what about the maximum distance?
Well, behaviorally, so for one example, with the Google project, looking at their lending program, we were shocked to see how far some of these commuters were riding. 10 miles was not that uncommon. And interestingly, people with the long commutes, 10, 15-mile commutes, I mean, that's round trip, sorry, they were biking nearly just as much as the people with short commutes. Now, these were car commuters who were targeted by the program, so they had to ride as a part of keeping the bike. So there's a lot of other pressures, but I think it showed that it's not just a 3-mile commute anymore, and so that's really the potential. I don't really know what the maximums are. Maybe Carlton or Andrew has some ideas there, but it's more than a conventional bike. And in academics, we think of like walking as under a mile or a quarter of a mile, and for biking we think of 3 miles. That's probably about it. But I think we're starting to stretch that a little
bit. In Europe, certainly on the mainland of Europe, you're getting these municipalities in Germany, in the Netherlands, to a lesser extent in Belgium, creating these Snell feet routes, in effect fast bicycle routes, which are going from city to city. So, okay, it's not the same as Texas between locations. The locations are going to be, cities are going to be shorter distance in Europe, but we're talking 10, 15 miles, as I would say, as an average for these fast bicycle routes, which are almost being designed for e-bikes, e-bike use, because traditionally there probably wouldn't have been that much demand for anything over, say, 5 to 7 miles for a traditional bike. With e-bikes in Europe, you are certainly extending that to 10 to 15 miles. And with these city-to-city routes, which are growing and growing and growing and getting more and more and more, that will only expand in the future as more and more people, in effect, ditch their cars because they can now get from city to city. If you, as we know, if you build these routes, they will get used. And it's not just a case of building these, these wiggly routes that look beautiful and you go past nice things. You've got to build very, very practical routes. So do what the Dutch are doing and build, in effect, fast freeways for bicycle use, and especially e-bike use.
I'd also like to just add as well that there is a movement towards people seeing e-bikes as not necessarily needing to get somewhere quickly. I've been seeing a lot of this talk that just because e-bikes are able to replace a car doesn't mean you need to get there in the same speed. And a lot of people are taking the advantage of being able to use the e-bike to cover these longer distances, but also to take the aspect of getting the long way home, where they will find themselves maybe taking a little bit of a detour, enjoying the fact that they have this freedom on the way home. And this is an interesting aspect to see, that it's not necessarily just about getting from A to B as fast as you can anymore. Bringing in a bicycle brings in that freedom, and the electric bike brings in the freedom with the ability to increase the range or increase the cadence that you're getting to somewhere. And I find that is a very interesting thing to be looking into as well.
Thanks, Andrew. Here's one from Dave Rabinowitz who's asking, we're saying, I'm waiting for an e-bike that allows the rider to add energy to the battery by pedaling harder than is necessary to maintain speed, for example, going downhill, and regenerative braking. When is this likely to appear?
It can exist in some bikes,
car.
sorry, but it's in a car it's more effective. In a bicycle, the power that you're putting back in is minimal. I think I don't know what needs to be done technically to make it more viable, but at the moment, the actual amount of power you can put back in from cycling is not going to be valuable enough to make it worthwhile.
I've seen this technology in the past. It does exist, but as Andrew says, it's negligible. You know, you don't have the mass, because the reason it works in an electric car is because these things are incredibly big and heavy, far heavier than a standard motor car. So when they come to brake, and when you put your e-pedal or whatever name the manufacturer calls it, the thing that stops the car, you don't need to use all the pedals in your car anymore. You just have the one pedal. When the car comes to a stop, there's just a huge mass that is doing that, and that's what generates the power. There just isn't the mass on the bicycle to really make that worthwhile. So it was there. I think Bionics, BION-X, I think they had a system about 6-7 years ago, which I rode on. When I went to Park City, Nevada, and we were shown the bicycles and told to ride downhill on them. And lo and behold, it did generate some power, but it was almost not worth it. So that's why the technology hasn't developed. We're not got cars, basically. We're not cars.
Thanks. Just a couple more here. Again, given the volume of questions that have come in and so many great ones, and we'll definitely share the rest with our panelists. We did get a couple comments and questions regarding the weight of e-bikes and how to manage that, especially if someone may have some challenges in moving them around. And so Frank Blake, for example, asked, how much heavier are e-bikes typically compared to regular bikes? I live in a second floor apartment and need to carry my bike to the apartment to have a secure place to store it. How can I handle that? Or is weight an issue, and are there lighter models?
Yes and yes. Weight is an issue, and there is lighter models. The great thing is that an e-bike is the same as a standard bike, only you're adding in the weight of a battery and a motor. If you could take off the battery and the motor, you'd weigh exactly the same as a standard non-electric bike. That being said, there are the ways then of removing a battery before you move a bike, which obviously takes out one of the biggest components of the extra weight. Or there are lighter weight bikes out there, electric bikes. One in our range, the Aspires, which I showed you, they are sub 40, which brings them into being about the same as a standard road bike. But again, you can work with this. I think I've also seen carbon bikes. I believe there's another Montreal company. I won't say their name because I can't remember it. But they make a very lightweight carbon commuter bike, which is a great idea. Wonderful. Living in a city on a second floor apartment does make it a little trickier for a lot of the low-end bikes of any kind, because you are always going to add weight. As you go more expensive, you're likely to be able to find weight reductions and ways to find the technology which is a lighter weight finish. As I said, carbon bikes is a great way to go to reduce the weight, but carbon is a very expensive material to be using, especially an electric bike, because you need to have the support.
Okay. Here's one from Paul Smamati, who's asking, I'm working on bike ped improvements for a growing suburban county. Do you have any recommended best practice guidance documents for incorporating the potentially higher speed of e-bikes into a bike network potentially commingled with non-e-bikes?
Good question. I mean, I usually point people to NACTO's guidelines in North America. if you have access to the Crow manual from the Dutch guidelines, that's amazing as well. Although harder to, basically NACTO is kind of jumping off from the Crow. But I don't know, and maybe Carlton would know, if there's been any updates that really touch on the needed widths for e-bikes. I don't think so yet.
Yeah, I've seen NACTO has covered this, and certainly the Crow manual, the Dutch bicycle guidance mentions it in passing. But yeah, as I said before, it's the potential is there for the future to have maybe different forms of stratified lane because of that speed differential, and because of the different kinds of mobility products which are going to definitely be coming on stream in the next 10, 15 years.
Okay, I guess I'll also mention this. We did get several folks who noted the relationship, I guess, of e-bikes to scooters, and whether where that line is relative to, I guess, both the use and maybe implications for infrastructure. If anybody could comment on that.
From my perspective, the scooters, it's a little trickier to deal with because as I was talking about the 3-class structure for electric bikes, there is nothing in place yet for scooters which seems to cover them in the same way. There's no global ruling through this. So you often find different places have different rules. And I think it's even, if you get down to Toronto, you can have a real hard time because you're not allowed to ride on the pavement because it's a motorized vehicle, so the sidewalk. You're not allowed to ride on the road because it's a scooter. So depending on which person pulls you over, you could be in trouble either way. So until there are guidelines in place which cover this, then I think it's always going to be very ambiguous as to how scooters fit into the whole situation. Also remembering that the wheel size of the scooter is very, very small. So the higher speeds on a scooter, I think this is one of the reasons why they have problems differentiating this. You need to have a lot more control at a higher speed when you're riding a scooter than you would do on an electric bike. So it's a very different set of rules which need to be applied.
And we also need to differentiate, as legislators tend to do, between share e-scooters, which tends to be where most of the regulations are aimed at, so the city share scooter schemes, and then the private e-scooter schemes. The share e-scooter schemes, the operators tend to be, well, they've got to be, very responsible. They've got all sorts of technology, bristling technology on these things, which we don't have in cars, bizarrely. Able to keep them off the sidewalks, with cameras, with all sorts of GPS technologies to limit their speeds. And yet we haven't got anywhere near the same amount of policing of the private e-scooters. And again, both get lumped in as the same form of transport, yet they're actually incredibly different forms of transport, certainly in the way they are policed. And it's the faster private e-scooters, the people who are not sticking to the rules and not sticking to the regulations, not sticking to even local laws, which are probably going to damage the whole e-scooter scene. And that's also, you can also look at that, as I said before, the unregulated e-bikes have the same problem, to bring down the whole scene of e-bikes. So it'd be quite good for legislators and planners to look at that in greater depth, and to actually really stress how these things are very different, and we need to tackle both of them, and potentially tackle the illegal ones in a much more forceful way than has happened to date.
Yeah, and I'll just add, so there's the regulation component, but in terms of infrastructure, there are some people studying this, and it's kind of an unknown whether we really need different type of infrastructure for different type of devices. And Carlton touched on this before, like we may need these kind of general purpose micromobility lanes that you can put a big delivery bike in, a delivery trike. You can have 3 e-scooters side by side, because riding side by side can encourage more riding. There's social aspect. I mean, so the wheel size is something that's talked about a lot, and a lot of that has to do with pavement roughness and maintenance. But in terms of do we really need something dramatically different? Do we need a scooter lane and a bike lane? I don't think anybody thinks that. I think that scooters still operate much like a bike, and so we just need to think more broadly about what type of lane and infrastructure is needed to accommodate this growing industry.
Okay, if I may, I'm going to ask two more and then we'll close, because we did also get some questions about insurance. And so this one from Maggie Rizarina asks, do classes of e-bikes impact the limitation of insurance for them? My homeowner's insurance won't cover my e-cargo bike since it has a motor, and my vehicle insurance won't cover it since it doesn't have a throttle. Do you have any insight on how to increase insurance options for e-bikes? They seem to be lost in between standard insurance and special bike insurance, and special bike insurance is necessary and not practical or affordable for many people.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Velosurance in the U.S. now has an e-bike policy. I could be wrong about that, but yeah, we either need more or broader insurance policies, or these services, these lease services, need to have that built into the service package. I don't know if there are other examples in Europe.
Yeah, well, because we've got a simpler system, so we haven't got those three classes. In effect, we have that one class with a little bit of a faster e-bike, which is very, very small in market size. It's much easier for the insurance to be just a standard pedal bicycle, really. There's no huge problem with getting your e-bikes insured, apart from the fact that they tend to be quite expensive. So just that ramps up the cost of insuring an expensive bicycle is going to be expensive.
Okay, well, let me close with this question from Bo Scott, who says, as a traditional cyclist in the southern US, the majority of motorists I find here hate cyclists and regard cyclists as a nuisance and someone to run over. How can we convince someone to ride an e-bike when traditional cyclists are taking their own lives in their hands every time they jump on the saddle?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It is something that the more people you get on bikes, Dillon did touch on this in his presentation, the more people you get on e-bikes, the more you expand the gene pool, in effect, the safer it becomes for everybody. So that is like a standard safety in numbers type concept. And it's e-bikes that are probably the mode that can actually do that, in that, we've had 120 years of fantastic bicycles out there, and we haven't had a huge amount of uplift in people using them. E-bikes expands that gene pool because it enables people who maybe wouldn't have got on a bicycle to now get on a bicycle for all sorts of different reasons, which Andrew, well, in fact, Andrew and Dillon both touched on in their presentations. So basically, e-bikes can be the tool to get more people on bikes, and more people on bikes generally makes it safer for everybody. In effect, the motorists can't get past. And unless they want to, really bully people to get out of the way, which absolutely does happen, but generally, the more bicyclists, the more e-bicyclists you get out there, the slower motorists have got to go, which clearly is of a huge concern to the car industry. One, they're getting into e-bikes themselves. We see that with Porsche, with Ford, all sorts of car companies are getting into e-bikes. But also we have this, the vehicle-to-vehicle technologies coming up, where every signpost, every car, everything on the road has got these RFID chips in them, and they talk to each other. And the car industry is incredibly intent on making sure every bicyclist is also chipped, and there are all sorts of different technologies that are being discussed and promoted by the auto industry, because the auto industry sees it as both a threat and an opportunity. It's that Schrodinger's cyclist.
Yeah, and I will just add that there is this sense of not just the safety in numbers, which is very clear. It's been replicated numerous times for walking and bicycling, which is very unlike driving. For driving, the more cars you have, the more crashes you have. It's not this nonlinear decay. But the other thing that is this is anecdotal, but I think is probably true, and that is that motorists, drivers, they become more accepting of it. So before I came to Davis, I rode my bike in San Diego. And riding my bike in San Diego is a very different experience than in Davis. And mostly, it's not that the infrastructure in Davis is so fabulous. There are places that are fabulous. But if you look at most city streets in Davis, they look like a normal city street. They have a bike lane. That's about it. But mostly, it's about the drivers being considerate and the drivers driving at reasonable speeds. And they do that in a little college town like Davis because there are so many people riding the bike. So I think you would see that there's not only this uptick, if more people jumped on bikes, you would also see this recognition from drivers that they need to slow down, that they need to be more considerate, and it would change their behavior and kind of approach to driving.
Great, thank you. We could definitely, thank you also for going over, and we could even go over longer with all the questions. So thank you for doing that, and thanks to everybody for submitting all the questions. And like I said several times, we will share all of them with our panelists today, and you also have the option of reaching out with them directly. So we're going to close here with some closing thoughts, and we'll start with Andrew.
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, thank you for having me here. It's been a wonderful experience. I would like to close by saying that electric bikes, as we've all stated, I think, they're great for the environment. They're great for personal health. They're great for the community. They get people around. They expand out the range that you can get. I would love to see these being picked up more. I would love to see some ways that we can get the infrastructure in place to support these different forms of transportation that we're looking at bringing in. My aim to do this is to try to get this conversation continuing. I put up the information about the iGo Twitter account. I will be sending out an email as well, which I'm hoping will be able to include some incentives to maybe get people talking a little more about this on social media, and possibly even looking at getting the bikes themselves to be part of the culture. So again, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and it's been a great experience.
Great, thank you. Dillon?
Yeah, I think closing, I would just say that while we're all talking about the great potential for e-bikes, I think we all, and I know the audience is a lot in the transportation planning and urban planning fields, and so I would just say don't expect the e-bikes to save us. We still need better infrastructure planning, and more importantly, we need better land use planning. In the North American context, we are still sprawling, and we are still growing in unsustainable ways. And I know that the Smart Growth Network is all about understanding how we can grow smartly. And so e-bikes just will help that a little bit, and maybe help that transition toward more sustainable growth.
Thank you. We'll give you the final word, Carlton.
Thank you. I'd like to say thank you for having me, and thank you also to Dillon and Andrew. And I'll echo their sentiments, and then I'll go straight into what Dillon said, in fact, and that because this seminar is being listened to, watched by transportation planners, I really cannot emphasize enough the infrastructure. So yes, more people on bikes, safety in numbers, it gets the use of bicycles up in general, but infrastructure has got to be something that has got to be put in place. And it's kind of ironic in many ways that both Dillon and Andrew are in fantastic places for bicycling. So Davis, California, which I've cycled around many times, where people fall off on those roundabouts when they start at college. And then Montreal, you know, with all of your bike paths, which were started in the 1970s. The Claire Morissette cycleway, one of the very, very early activists in the 1970s who got all of these incredible cycleways put in Montreal. So that kind of tells you that, you know, the reason Davis has people on bikes and the reason Montreal has lots of people on bikes is because they've got lots and lots of cycleways. So more cycleways, please, planners.
Thank you. You've given us all something to do as well. Well, I thank you all for being here today. And with this, we'll conclude our webinar, The Past, Present, and Future of Electric Bicycling. I'd like to offer a giant thank you to Carlton Reid, Dillon Fitch, and Andrew Brown for a great presentation, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen every single time. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. When you exit today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on other future webinars. We are working on a number of other programs for this summer and beyond. With that, I wish everyone a great day. Take care.